Welcome to Presence, a global conversation for a new earth, with hosts Doug King and Cody Deese.
Thanks, and I appreciate everybody being with us today. Great to have you with us, and I am here, as usual, with my partner, Mr. Cody. How in the world are you, buddy?
I'm well. I'm sitting here. I've got a large Diet Arnold Palmer from the Christian chain of Chick-fil-A. The door is open, so if you hear strange noises, planes, etc., it's open to my sunroom because the sun is blazing. And if you look out, there's some beautiful flowers out there.
Yeah.
I am loving my life right now.
Yeah, it's gorgeous here. It's beautiful here.
And all the windows are kind of just like actual light is coming through.
Yeah. It's good. And especially because in Atlanta this year, I think we set records for rain through the winter. It was an incredible amount of rain we got this year. So it's great to see this coming on the scene today. And that air feels great coming through the door.
And when the pollen clears out, I thought we should probably just start recording out in the sunroom.
Ooh, I'd like that.
That'd be great.
It would be.
All right. Ladies and gentlemen, an introduction to Integral Theology Part 1.
Love it.
How does that sound, Doug?
Oh, I wish we would have recorded a trumpet or something there, had some sound in there. That sounds great.
Okay, we're going to do the next couple episodes a little bit different. I am going to interview Doug King. Okay, now it's going to fall into a little bit of the same patterns, but I want to take a little bit of a different approach. So if you're ready.
Of course,
Doug,
let's do it.
Let's do this.
Oh, I'm
for those that are listening.
Sure.
He is the CEO of Presence International, where they are curating a global conversation for a new earth. Presence is a nonprofit organization contributing to the developmental evolution of individual and collective spiritual consciousness. People, give it up for Doug King.
That's funny. You really are doing it up, aren't you, man?
Yes.
That is funny.
Doug, welcome to the Presence Podcast.
Hey, Cody, thank you. It's a pleasure to be here today.
Now, you live in Atlanta, right?
Yes.
Okay.
Technically Northeast Gwinnett County, Cody. I'm outside the city limits, and I have a wife and
what's
Danae.
her name?
Yes.
Danae, yes.
Danae, yeah.
How many grandkids again?
We've got 5 now. We have
Good
5
Lord, because you just
grandkids.
added one, right?
Just added one. Little Hadley May is here, and Hadley is, as of this moment, heading on toward 3 months.
Healthy?
Oh, yeah.
Beautiful.
Yeah. Everybody's happy and healthy, and
so you are
very blessed. Very
you are
blessed.
in zone in life right now.
Oh, yeah. It's a great place to be.
And they come to the house and like y'all just hang out outside?
Oh, yeah. We're Party City because, again, we have the Presence location where we are, which is about 5.5 plus acres or so, and big old house. And it's purely so that Danae and I can use it as kind of a bed and breakfast for people that want to have the discussion you and I are about to have today. And we use it for the family.
I love it. Well, let's get to it, Doug.
I'm ready.
Introduction to Integral Theology Part 1.
Yeah.
I want to start with this question. In order to come around to, because what I want to do is get around to a working definition of integral theology. But in order to do that, it's important to begin with a brief history of integral.
Yeah.
What is the origin of integral, or would you start with the word integral, or is the origin integral theory?
Yeah.
Can you tell us a little bit about the history and how all this, the framework, the wording, all that kind of came to be?
Absolutely. If you look at the folks who study in this particular field, they will historically go back actually to a time when no one used the term integral. If you go all the way back, some will trace it back to Hegel, who started from 1770 to like 1830, somewhere in there, right around late 1700s, early 1800s. And Hegel actually began to think about the fact that all the major eras of the world transpired out of conflict, where you had different conflicts of worldviews, different conflicts of perspectives. This later on in spiral dynamics will end up being called the unworkable, which we talk about consistently. But you have these different conflicting worldviews that happen within these eras. And so you move from the Egyptian dynasty to the Greek dynasty and Roman and so forth. And so Hegel is beginning to realize that there's a dialectical way that evolution happens. And then after that, you have people like Alfred North Whitehead, who came a little bit later than Hegel, who added his 2 cents worth. You have Teilhard de Chardin.
Okay, I know that. I recognize that name.
Okay.
Paleontologist?
Yes, as well as a priest.
The phenomenon of man?
Yes, that is correct. The phenomenon of man. So you're having people that are thinking about the fact that human beings are going through worldviews and eras of time, and the perceptions and worldviews are changing and how they're changing, and that every new worldview has elements of the previous worldview, and yet it brings something new to it. This will later in spiral dynamics be called the concept of include and transcend. And so then after that, you move into the work of a guy named Gebser, Jean Gebser, who is the first person in the 1950s to use the word integral. So if you want to actually trace, Cody, the word integral, it goes back to Gebser, who is realizing, he's the first guy to really realize that modernity was a thing. In other words, we talk about it as a thing, but it's because we've able to look back and observe it. You have to remember, when you're in the traditional era, you don't know it. When you're in the modern era, you don't know it. It's only until you get beyond these things that you look back and give them a name. You don't realize it when you're we're in the traditional age. Nobody knew that. So Gebser was the one that recognized modernity, and then he realized something else was pointing even beyond that. And that's when you have people like Clare Graves coming in the 1960s and 1970s. And Clare Graves was the one who really started putting language to these levels that humanity seems to have gone through. As you look at big history, big data, that there are these levels of understanding, perceptions, levels of consciousness that humanity had gone to. Don Beck came along and turned Clare Graves' work into a concept called spiral dynamics, as Graves never used that term himself. And Don Beck, to this day, has been a major world leader in the use of spiral dynamics in many different fields, whether they be finance, education, politics, etc. After his work,
Don Beck still being alive, correct?
Don Beck, yes, very much so.
Okay.
And continuing to do great work. And then, of course, as you move into the later stages, in the 90s, we begin to hear from a guy named Ken Wilber, who's still very much active and one of the most prolific writers in this whole field called integral consciousness. And so you have this thing that goes back 300 years that no one really knew what was happening, couldn't put their finger on it, but they were actually describing elements that later would be realized were elements of an integral approach to life, where we see all the levels that brought us here today. Just like when you grow up as a kid, you have brought everything you learned in all 12 grades. You went to school or college or whatever. You're bringing all of that. And each time you went to a new grade, you transcended the previous ones, but you included what you learned in those grades. And so when you get to be an adult, you have kind of an integral view of everything you learned in every grade. And yet you're beyond all those grades.
That's good. That's a good analogy.
Yeah.
So it's almost like people begin to observe. So think about puberty. Think about childhood, adolescence, adulthood.
Yes.
In the same way, that being external, they begin to observe an internal reality of that.
Yes, that's right.
And so they, and correct me, I'm just trying to put some language to this, but they begin to realize just as there's childhood, adolescence, adulthood, there are also stages of your internal consciousness.
Correct. That's right.
So would you say, when we use the phrase integral, we're using it in this context? We're speaking of a stage of consciousness.
That's right. The integral stage is that which transcends all first-tier levels. For example, we've talked many times in previous podcasts, Cody's, about fundamentalism in the traditional age that most of us who are old enough to remember, and you don't have to be that old. I mean, the traditional church, in essence, traditional religion is still alive and very well and is still out there. That was an era from which people transcended and grew. But it was a perspective that had a whole list of elements that were common to everybody within that worldview. So yeah, that's the way the levels work.
Okay, and for our listeners, some of this may be repetitive. You know this, but
Yeah.
I am in the driver's seat and I'm interviewing, so I get to ask whatever questions I want.
And we've had a lot of people ask us could we go
Certainly
back
have.
and recap this and bring clarity to it? Look, this is just appearing on the planet. The things we're proposing theologically are things that are, again, transcending old interpretations of the text. So it's good to go back, recap, reconsolidate, and simplify as much as possible these concepts to just reinforce them.
Absolutely. Okay, so before we go into the next question, where would you point people if they're at a starting place of even integral theory, of understanding it? Who's your go-to? Where would be an easy place to start?
Well, I put a lot of people onto a book, my Steve McIntosh, just simply called Integral Consciousness. That's his first book. And what I like about Steve's book is that he literally has a section where he gives the history that I just went through of all the people who were beginning to see how consciousness was evolving on a worldview level from the 1700s forward. It's got some great history in there. Also, Steve does a real good job of outlining all of the first tier levels and what their particular parameters were. In other words, what are all the elements that belong to the warrior? What are all the elements that belong to the tribal, and so on and so forth? And they're put in a very simplistic form in charts where you can literally go down the chart, one chart, and see all the levels and see how that level would perceive the world and existence and life conditions and that kind of thing. So I would highly recommend Steve's book. Another book that helped me that is not as big as it sounds is a book by Wilber called A Theory of Everything. It's a smaller book. It's easy to consume as a first reading. And so that's a good one. Now, Don Beck has the master book called Spiral Dynamics, but that book is far more technical. It's great. It's fantastic. But I'm saying if you want to read something first, you might go to some of those other books before you jump into the actual book, Spiral Dynamics itself.
And I've read Steve's book, and I would just echo what you're saying.
Oh, good.
It was the best gateway for me.
Great.
To fully kind of grasp and understand what was happening. Okay.
Good.
I'd like to get personal for a minute.
Yeah.
Because we don't talk much about on this podcast. This is why I really enjoy. By the way, I'm really doing a good job on this interviewing.
You are.
But I love my 6 Enneagram. Had to validate myself, but
right.
We don't talk a lot about your personal life, so I want to get into that for just a minute.
Right.
How did you get exposed to the integral conversation? At what age were you when you were first introduced to this? And what, were there certain elements of your life that brought that on?
Yeah. Well, absolutely. For one thing, because my theology was constantly evolving from the early 70s all the way through the 80s and the 90s and into the 2000s now, I've been on a theological journey where I was beginning to see a bigger and bigger and bigger God. And I was beginning to completely reframe some of the things that people have been teaching within the religion of Christianity. And so I was already part of an evolutionary process, and I knew it. I knew it because people were telling me a lot of the things that I thought meant that I couldn't be part of their fellowship. I couldn't be part of their church. I couldn't even be part of their particular seminary in one case. And so I already knew, Cody, that this evolution thing was a reality for me personally. So I had a personal experience of it. Now, as I moved into late 90s, early 2000s, I actually began to have conversations with one of my brothers who had come upon the work of Don Beck and who had come upon some of the Wilber books. And it was my brother, Tim, who actually introduced me to those things. Now, I'm not sure how he'd have to be here. I'm not sure how he found that 20 plus years ago, but that's how I got introduced to it. And then when I began to read the books, Cody, and I began to think about the biblical narrative, I was hooked. It made sense. And it made sense to me that in all other aspects of life, science was understanding greater and greater complexities. People in biology were understanding greater and greater complexity. And it makes sense that our human worldviews were becoming more and more understanding of the complexity of the human. And so all of this made perfect sense to me. And then, of course, when I combined it with what I saw in theology, it just verified my faith, really. It was just another way of validating all the things that I was beginning to see when I read the biblical narrative.
And that's what I want to get at. When did you connect integral theory, framework, integral consciousness, what you're hearing, with the biblical narrative? Because in my opinion, obviously I'm a bit biased because for those that aren't know, I'm interviewing this man, but I'm also the president of the organization.
Tongue in cheek.
But I think that's the niche. So if you're asking me, what does presence do best? It is integral theology, which is the point of all this. And we're going to get to a working definition and all that stuff down the road. But I'm still interested in your personal life of when you began to read these concepts and go back to the narrative and all of a sudden the lights start popping on. Because as we've worked through it and it's happened to me, you can tell how exciting it is.
Sure.
But can you talk to us about that experience when you were like, oh, like you would read it and be like, oh my, and you started putting these things together?
Yeah, it was exciting. I can remember when I did it in the early part of the 2000s, as I was reading this stuff, it was really describing how the human race has begun to understand the commonality of our race and the commonality that would lead to concepts like universalism, which were taboo, dirty words in the realm of religion, especially the more traditional fundamental religions, which were very much more denominated, very much more strict about their boundaries. So when I began to see how consciousness was evolving and that the higher levels of consciousness were going to greater and greater inclusivity, the first verse that hit me, and I've used it in these previous podcasts, I've used it with you, but the first verse that hit me was where Paul says that after all things are accomplished, it will be so that God can be all in all. And when I thought about integral, excuse me, when I thought about integral, I thought immediately of Paul talking about God as all in all, and that hit me between the eyes. Oh my goodness, why should we think that if this narrative is actually something that I can put my faith into from the standpoint that it's actually explaining to me the nature of spirit and the way my understanding of that spirit has evolved through time and that humans evolve through time, it should not be surprising at all that that's the case. So I actually saw an integral level of God to start with, and I went backwards. I went all the way back, and I thought, well, yeah, but how does that apply to archaic? And when I was first thinking of archaic, I was thinking like, oh, well, you wouldn't have an archaic church or an archaic Christianity. And then I thought, wait a minute, the narrative starts with Adam. And then it was like, oh my gosh. And from there, man, it was like, wait, archaic Adam, and then tribal Abraham. Oh my gosh. And then, it's like chill time. I mean, chills are coming all over me. And I'm just like, oh my gosh, this is exactly what integral theory is telling us, is the same thing the narrative's telling us.
And so when you started seeing that pattern and you started writing some of this, curious, first of all, do you have a relationship with Wilber and Beck and these guys that are still around that are like early adopters of this? But have they heard your perspective of taking some of their work and threading it through the biblical narrative?
Yes, they've been very good to me, very kind to me. Don Beck has actually been to our property here in Atlanta area. He spent a weekend with us. Ken Wilber has been kind enough on 2 different occasions to host me where he lives in Denver, Colorado. I've been in to talk with him a couple of times about these paradigms. Steve McIntosh has been to where Danae and I used to live in Colorado Springs. He and his wife came down one evening. He also invited me up to his house. I've drawn from all these guys, even though their main focus in using integral theory, spiral dynamics, their main focus has not been in the same realm as mine. When you enter, this is why I wanted to write in the realm of theology. They don't focus on those fields. They're more in tune and know so much more than I'll ever know about how this applies in world politics, world finance, education, and those kinds of things. So yeah, they're all great guys. They've all been very generous to me, very helpful to me, and I have drawn very heavily from their work, and am the first person to promote all their works because I find them just very, very useful. So yeah, I've had very good experiences there.
And that's the thing that I think is important for our listeners to understand too, that don't know, is integral theory, or that stage of consciousness, is in every facet of life. Yeah. So there is endless amounts of work on integral economics, politics, religion, spirituality, on and on the list goes. That this is a stage of consciousness on a global level that they're saying people are rising into, and the percentage being over 15% flips the whole paradigm for the universe. So I want to. We'll probably have to end with this question with time. Right. And then, of course, we're just getting started. Sure. Because I have microphones and I love interviewing.
Well, and I just want to make this commitment to you, Cody, that I will be glad to come back again next week.
I love it. Based on what you just said, and even the distinction between integral theory and integral theology, which is what we're talking about, which is what your niche is, which is what we do at Presence, which is what, wink, wink, hint, hint, down the road, a book should be written about.
There you go. Right.
What is your working definition of integral theology?
Yeah, and integral theology starts again with that famous verse by Paul that God is all in all, and as we like to say, not all in some. That the whole history of humanity has been going from particularistic to universal. Mm. And so for an integral theology, it's tracing the history of how human beings have come to understand their universal God identity. Mm. That is where we are today. And this is what has always caused the conflicts in history. It started way back in the tribal era. And if you were from a different tribe, there was going to be trouble. There was going to be conflict. If you were from a different country, if you were from a different religion, all the way up till now, if you were different in terms of your LGBTQ standing, all these things, everything that's conflict from the most current today all the way back through history has been because people have drawn lines and boundaries that separate those that are from those that are not. And human beings determine those that are from those who are not. When you get into integral and an integral theology, theos, is a study of God. And the nature of God is integral, Cody. It's all in all. There is no one that is not created in the image of God. There's no one that's not God-breathed. There's no one whose essence is different from my essence. The question is simply a one of consciousness. How conscious am I of that image? How conscious are others of that image? But it is the fact that God is all in all. This is why so many people, Rob Bell got in so much trouble. He began to see, wait a minute, love wins. Why? Because that's the nature of theos. Theos, God, is love. Well, how in the world can we draw these boundaries where we say love doesn't win? How can we say that we as humans are powerful enough to defeat that which God has created and that which God has done through history? It becomes more ridiculous to us. So that is why when you're getting into an integral theology, it will allow you to look at all these levels and allow you to see why there were things like priesthoods and temples and religion itself, why there was religion. And it will have new questions raised that will be very troubling. And that is, should we have made Jesus a religion? Have we, in fact, repeated the mistakes of the past? Is there a better way forward for our future? These are all questions that I think we can obviously talk about in future podcasts. But that, for me, is what integral theology is about. It, for me, answers the questions that are plaguing those that are still in these conflicts and still in these divisive, separating, discriminating modes.
So how do you know if a theology is integral? A theology is integral when, are there marks of that? Are there things that you can pin? Are there external realities? Are there internal realities that you can point at that say, this is how you know a theology is operating from an integral stage of consciousness?
Yeah, and of course, there's a short answer and a long answer. When I got into this trajectory, which we haven't brought up yet, of form, transform, and formlessness, that was the way in which I could define stories, narratives, whatever you want to bring up that's a discussion of ultimate reality that was going to be, in my mind, integral. It was going to be something that moved beyond a human being attached to a form. A form is a particularism that you either are or you are not. And that defines your God identity. And that movement beyond forms, wearing special robes and clothing, or being part of a denomination or a religion or whatever, those are all forms. And so when we talk about that in the future, or review, because we've had podcasts on this before, that was really the major thing. And so if you have a theology, if you have a narrative, what I want to do is sit down and talk with you about that to which your narrative points as the nature of ultimacy.
And even hearing that, like if I were to mark out some bullet points, tell me if you think this is accurate. But a sign of integral theology, or someone that has a theology at an integral stage of consciousness, would be universalism.
Yes.
Greater inclusion.
Right.
These are all signs of an external reality of what's happening. Last question. How is integral theology different from integral spirituality? Or is there a difference?
Well, I would say that integral theology is basically a historical study from metaphorical Adam all the way through the actual work of Jesus of Nazareth in the body of Christ and so forth.
Okay. Yep, that makes sense to me, because I feel like I have seen books out there on integral spirituality. Right. But what I haven't seen is integral theology, which hashtag we got the copyright, don't take it.
Right.
But I wanted to know, like if that's in a book format, what would be the distinction between the two, which is what I think we do at present.
Yeah, we bring history into it, because that is at the guts of integral theory, is you have to look at the history to see how these things evolve through history. This is why the Bible is all about history and the history of these phases and levels. And that is what we are bringing into the light, if you will, that hasn't been really talked about to this time.
Ladies and gentlemen, he's the CEO of Presence International. They are curating a global conversation for a new earth. We're just getting started. This has been an introduction to integral theology part 1, and I love saying it. That's why I've said it 3 times, and I'll say it again next week. We'll jump into part 2. We're just getting started. Man, go outside, stare into the sun, and hope you have a great, great week.
Thank you for joining us today. If you have any questions or comments, please contact us at info@presence.tv. You can also visit our website at presence.tv or find us on Facebook. We look forward to hearing from you.